So as we listen for the words recorded by the person identified as Mark and the person identified as Matthew this morning, words that they recorded of Jesus, I'm going to continue to hold these three invitations before you. An invitation to see life as a wondrous mystery, an invitation to see everyone and each thing as sacred, and an invitation to be, to sink into being as opposed to thinking there needs to be an action and response. And as always, as one of the 20th century's finest theologians, Paul Tillich, wrote at the top of all of his sermons the words, "for myself." So the words I'm going to read to you this morning, I'm going to read both Mark's version and Matthew's version. I always recall them as coming to me like, oh, that's harsh. I'll let you decide whether or not these are harsh words or profoundly wise words, or maybe both. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Better for you to enter life maimed than to have two hands and go to hell. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, rip it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and to be thrown into hell. Or this version, if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of the members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. I received this book for Christmas. It's called The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. And sure enough, doesn't it address the subject of wonder, the sacredness of every creature, and the invitation to live in the moment? Elizabeth Tova Bailey wrote The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating while confined to her bed with a debilitating disease. The snail, which had entered her life via the gift of a potted plant, was her daily companion. In its life and in its practices, she discovered an entire universe that both challenged her and nurtured her through her long illness. As she was forced to abandon more and more of the universe that was familiar to her, the snail and its universe became her lifesaver. She moved through the painstaking process of researching this tiny mollusk and discovered a creature that is complex and wondrous beyond measure. So let me just share with you a couple of excerpts, which, as I was reading it, and as you listen to it, so challenges our perception that we are the most complicated beings on the planet, and therefore the most important. In the 4th century BC, in the history of animals, Aristotle noted that snail teeth are sharp and small and delicate. My snail possessed around 2,640 teeth. So I'd add the word plentiful to Aristotle's description. The teeth point inward so as to give the snail a firm grasp on its food. With about 33 teeth per row and maybe 80 or so rows, they form a multi-toothed ribbon called a radula, which works much like a rasp. This explained my snail's nodding head as it grated away at a mushroom. It also explained the odd squareness of the holes I had discovered in my envelopes and lists. As the front row of teeth gets worn down, a fresh new row is added at the back, and the radula slowly moves forward, being completely replaced over the course of 4 to 6 weeks. Radulae are adapted to a particular snail's diet and can be identifying characteristics of a species. With only 32 adult teeth, which had to last the rest of my life, I found myself experiencing tooth envy toward my gastropod companion. And this. As I glided further into the dusky mollusk volumes, I discovered that gastropods, which account for 80% of all mollusks, are one of the most successful animal groups. They have existed for 500 million years, surviving or evolving through several mass extinction events. They make their home in nearly every habitat on Earth, while 35,000 living terrestrial snail species have been documented. Tens of thousands are not yet identified. The majority of these microscopic, as Ernest Ingersoll points out in his 1881 essay, In a Snailery. Some snail species are so minute that they would not hide the letter O in this print. Life is about lessons in perception. Life is about lessons in perception. And we focus uniquely on those lessons during this season of Epiphany. It is a season for seeking clarity and insight or outsight. And as I read about the universe that is the snail's life, I thought about how we learn to look at our lives. A few things strike me. First, as humans, and believe me, I'm the humanities type. I remember being introduced to this in grade 8 science and going, we are so blind to much of the natural world that is right in front of our face. We are too caught up in a culture that insists that we are what we do. The snail has so much to teach us about how we perceive the way we use our time and the way we perceive our achievements. Elizabeth experienced so much emotional healing by the presence of this creature who was not caught up in a flurry of anxiety and activity as most of her friends were. She talked about her friends dropping in for a visit and often wishing they would leave because they brought their whole world of anxiety and this into the room with them. Furthermore, she discovered in her research that this creature had the power to self-heal, had incredible strength for its size, and a mountain full of resilience. I suspect we have those three things too. We might discover if we were to slow down. I have an idea that once we have the basics covered, shelter, food, we're fortunate in this context that those things are usually covered. What is left? Everything that is left is up to perception. I actually wanted to add health as among the basics, except we know, particularly as we age, that health is never a given and always a gift. And in fact, it is often as a result of a medical diagnosis that we learn to perceive life differently. The author of this book, in the midst of her illness, and really she couldn't even get out of bed, developed a new way of seeing. A way of seeing that saved her life. So that despite the fact that she could not get out of bed, she experienced the wonder of life by connecting with the creature who was her companion, and who then served as a window into a whole other universe, which then allowed her to claim with gratitude that, wow, was being alive, even in her bed, a wondrous gift. I'm not suggesting it's a walk in the park, but in discovering the universe that existed within the circle of her sight and within a creature that shared this planet with her, she encountered the joy of wonder and the gift of healing. So I thought back to that conversation with those men who declared that 3 of those lessons were lifetime lessons. Recognizing the wonder of it all, recognizing the sacredness in every creature, and recognizing that life was more than just doing and achieving and getting there. But some of the most profound gifts were recognized just in being. So let's get back to those words of Jesus now that we've recovered from how harsh they are. Jesus invited people to a different way of seeing things, which then resulted in a different way of being in the world that recognized the sacred in each person, in each moment. He went so far as to suggest that the way we saw things would open up for us either heaven or hell in the here and now. He wasn't talking about later. He never was. We can find ourselves in hell, which is probably where the author of the book began her journey, where we lose our ability to see the sacred, or we could find ourselves in the wonder of it all, where it's all sacred. His audience was a community of Jewish peasants who couldn't win. They had the Roman soldiers on one side of them and the religious aristocracy on the other side. Think Northern Ireland in a previous era. Who won? The propensity would be to feel squeezed and powerless and resentful and hopeless. The empire would squeeze you financially, and your religion, rather than giving you a framework with which to cope, would simply reinforce your understanding of the other as being the enemy, and we all know where that goes. So Jesus was wanting to give his community a different framework in which to see their lives. He invited them then to connect with wildflowers, with the cycles of the earth, with a shared meal. The little things, he suggested, could be made to be the big things. And the big things, like the soldier outside your door who were watching your every move, and the religious laws that demanded more than you could give, those could be made the little things. You decide, was his counsel. You decide. And if your eye could only see with vengeance and frustration so that you only had the bile of resentment eating you up, then you will need to cut out your eye, won't you? Or if your arm wanted nothing more than to grab the sword of the oppressor and heave it into his chest, then cut off your arm. Because we can see, can't we, where that line of action was going to take us. I have a friend who contacted me on Friday about a work situation that for her has been ongoing, whereas she is constantly being undermined by an employee. It sends her around the bend. There is a clear power struggle in play, with the employee refusing to be a team player. But after a couple of sleepless nights, she decided it was time to do something that would busy her mind, so she started cleaning her fridge. And in that practice, she got what she needed, some distance. And with that distance, she began to see the situation a little differently. And recognized that rather than engaging in the power struggle, calling another meeting, sending an email with clear directives, all of which was her right to do, she would simply not engage. And hell became heaven. But it took some time. It always takes time to see that further engagement, though legitimate on her part, would, given the circumstances and the personalities involved, be completely futile. It takes time. And very often, discipline to learn how to teach the eyes to see the wiser option. And in the context in which Jesus was teaching, where responding with resentment could get you killed, Jesus' invitation to pluck out an eye wasn't so radical after all. Can't you see, he said? That age-old tit-for-tat reasoning is nothing less than futile, and all of those ancient resentments, well, who are they killing? So if you're powerless to change the context, says Jesus, and you are, change the way you see things, learn to see another way, or else you're just going to miss the wonder of it all. Blake's take on seeing was a little different. He said that everything we saw provided a window to perhaps heaven, like the wildflower, or in his poem that was on the front of the bulletin that didn't get printed, perhaps hell. So that poem goes on to include this line. Like the dog starved at his master's gate, predicts the ruin of the state, suggesting that the real test of the empire was its treatment of the vulnerable. Kind of like the real test of the county will be its response to the housing crisis, not the number of articles in tourism magazines that highlight its recreational value. But that all depends the way you see it, doesn't it? So I invite you now during this time for contemplation to think about where in your life you are being encouraged to see in a different way. Is there a piece of art on the wall that might be a catalyst to this shift in seeing? Or is there a circumstance in your life that might be better served by a different way of being rather than an action strategy?